Welcome to today's edition of Daytime Dialogues. It is my great honor and privilege to welcome a friend to this conversation, Moishe Bane, who is the president for the last 4.5 years of the Orthodox Union. He has really brought it to new heights, and he has faced those challenges that we're not going to talk about this last year in magnificent ways, with the OU really pivoting to help lead our community in a truly brilliant and inspiring fashion. He is not just the president of the OU, however. He is also a senior partner at Ropes and Gray, a very significant law firm in New York. He is the co-chair of bankruptcy and business restructuring there. And he is a balabas who's been involved in so many different aspects of our Jewish community, nationally and locally, that I'm honored that he's giving us a half hour of his time today. Thank you so very much.
Rabbi Matanki, in light of the hours and hours and hours I have called on your time over the last 4.5 years, a half hour from me is nothing.
Well, thank you. I want to get started on talking about your column that you just wrote in the Jewish Action, where you talked about pan-Orthodox leadership. And for those who haven't had a chance to read it, it's a fascinating article. Its premise is the time has come for us all to get together and figure out ways that we can work together. I do think we had a small example of it at the beginning of the pandemic, where everyone was scared to get and moved along together in lockstep for a period of time, for sure. Do you really think something like that is possible?
Well, the concept of Jewish unity is something that spans generations, and it's something that everybody talks about. It's sort of like the weather. Everybody talks about it, but no one does anything about it. And it's a value. It's a core value of Judaism. Achdut is a underlying premise of Kabbalat Torah was as a joint people, and it's a value that we have in terms of strengthening our accessibility to a relation to God. But as we all know, there are myriad resistances for all kinds of political, theological, and practical reasons. The premise of my article is that until now, it has been basically an ideal that might be strived for, but it wasn't compulsory. And what I was trying to illustrate was that there are currently major influences that really precludes us from avoiding that kind of joint effort. There are so many confrontations that we face that are necessarily intertwined among the segments of orthodoxy that we can't possibly do anything serious without there being an overlap of communities. And therefore, maybe the practicalities of the situation will compel a sacrifice of ideology, political or other resistances in favor of trying to make some concession to work together.
But your closing paragraph in that article was also about the need, what would have to be an element of secrecy around it. It's because I guess there are so many different competing values and people who are going to schlep you one way or the other, that if this can be done quietly, it could work. Can anything happen quietly in our community anymore?
Well, I think there is a lot of things that happen already quietly. And the reason we don't know about them is because they're being dealt with quietly. And I think it's by necessity, not only because of political courage that it takes to do things publicly that may not be there, but there's also concessions that you would have political and even ideological resistances to, that if it's not with a public face, it simply doesn't have the same consequence ideologically, because you're not setting a premise for future issues or giving a message. One of the other points I made in the article is that by and large, most of Jewish leadership, Orthodox leadership, is segmented. We're very tribal within the Orthodox community. And as an overall observation, it works. And that is the way it should be. I gave an interview about a year ago on a website in Israel called Kikar Shabbat, which is the equivalent of an American website, but for more of the right of center community in Israel. And one of the questions they posed to me was, why doesn't the Orthodox Union have the equivalent of a Mo'etzet Gedolei Torah like Aguda does? And my response was, because our community is so disparate in different types of Jews in different types of the country with different types of experiences, and therefore it would be presumptuous of the OU to have a single body of rabbis dictating local policy on a absolute basis. We are very respectful of the fact that different types of experiences and different types of cultures demand different types of rabbinic guidance. And therefore, by and large, the system of fractioning our community's leadership works, and it's much more personalized and effective. There are, however, instances where there are global implications, and we can no longer pretend that there isn't an interplay between one and the other. And the OU is in the middle of so many of those instances, not the least of which is with regard to kashrus, where you can no longer say, well, one hechsher is for one community, another hechsher is for another community, because products today are so sophisticated in their ingredient composition that you need so many hechsherim to be reliable for all the ingredients to be acceptable in the end product. So that's just an illustration of the kind of composition that we have among parts of the Orthodox community that really need to rely on each other, sometimes better off in private than in public.
Well, it's interesting on that piece of kashrus, this coming year is going to be a Shemitah year. And so what's fascinating, and I know this from the Chicago side of kashrus, that while many poskim will rely on the heter mechira of the chief rabbinate, nevertheless, when it comes to American kashrus, because of the interplay of all of the different hashkachas, we will rely on something from Israel that was done under the heter mechira, but we won't use it as ingredients in our various products to make sure that we have the broadest number of people. And when people hear that, sometimes it bothers them, but it's a reality of trying to keep people together in kashrus and not separating kashrus.
Oh, absolutely. I'll tell you a very interesting episode. Until COVID happened, one of my deprivations of COVID was that it stopped. For the prior 3 years, my wife and I were traveling around the country, community by community, meeting with communities, meeting with shuls, meeting with schools, meeting with lay leadership and rabbinic leadership, and you learn a lot. And one of the most strange places for us to have been invited to spend Shabbos was Borough Park. And we were by a kahila in Borough Park asked us to come, and on Shabbos afternoon I was asked to give a shiur, which I gave, which was a little presumptuous for me to give shiurim because I'm no rabbinic personality. But in any event, at the end there was a question and answer period, and as is usually the case, many of the questions related to OU kosher. And I represented to the group there, which was about 100, mostly Hasidish type men, that I'm convinced that the OU is the most reliable hechsher in the world right now. And the degree of care and the degree of objectivity that we're able to have is enormous. And one of the other men said, well, are you telling me that I could eat any OU product? And I said, absolutely not. He said, well, you just told me it's the most reliable hechsher. I go, reliability means that whatever we say it is, it is. But I'm sure you are makbid, you're careful not to eat something that's not chol of Yisrael. The OU is not makbid on chol Yisrael, so you can't eat those OU products. You may very well be makbid on pas Yisrael, meaning bread that's made exclusively by Jews. The OU is not keeping that standard. What we say we keep, I could assure you that we keep, but we have disparate approaches in halacha and chumras and kulas that we rely on, and we should respect them all. So as much as there are people who might be offended that how could you not give a hechsher publicly to someone that's relying on the heter mechira, there are people who are offended that the OU gives hechsher because even when it's not chol of Yisrael. We have to learn how to respect each other and appreciate that there are different positions, and everyone is entitled to that, and that makes our community more robust and I think at the end of the day healthier.
I'm sorry for losing my words for a moment. During the recent unfortunate situation with Gaza, at the very same time, the Pew study came out regarding American Jewry, the latest one. And there were a lot of fascinating findings in it. Among them is the continued strength and growth of the Orthodox community. Unfortunately, the sample size of the Orthodox community was too small that they weren't able to break it down by some of the ways that we break it down, yeshivish, chassidish, etc. But one of the things they found was that we're losing a lot of Orthodox Jews, that while we are growing significantly, there's a lot who are born Orthodox who, when they are older, are no longer identifying as Orthodox. I know the OU has this extraordinary department of research, which was really your initiative to get the data before you make
myself along with Alan Fagan.
Okay, with Alan Fagan, but it was something exceptional. Do you have data in terms of what they call in Israel datlash, datilisha avar people from our community? Is it really as bad as Pew says?
I don't believe, we don't have exact data. We haven't done that study with that degree of particularity. We have done a variety of studies for very limited segments of the community at different stages in life. And there is definitely a dropout rate. Whether the dropout rate is anywhere as dramatic as being represented by Pew is questionable, because one of the major flaws in the Pew report is how someone is designated to being Orthodox, conservative, reform, or other. And the system that is used is self-identification. Self-identification is a very subjective term. Like, for example, I remember years ago, I was reading an earlier Pew report, and it had an enormous percentage at that time, much less today, of Orthodox Jews who were intermarrying. I said, how could that be? It's hard to decipher. It's a contradiction in terms. And I began to realize that people who belonged to an Orthodox synagogue listed themselves as Orthodox, even if they weren't Shomer mitzvahs at all. When it's rather than it being an assignment of label based on behavior, which I think would be a far more credible approach. The more significant flaw in the report that derives from that approach is the segregation of the amount of Jews who are Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox. So, for example, if you have 10% of the Jews identified as Orthodox, about 95% go to Orthodox shuls on a consistent basis, most of them every week or more. The Reform movement, which is listed at 30+%, almost half of them don't even belong to a Reform institution and certainly never visit a Reform institution, but they're called Reform. And therefore the Reform movement says, look how large we are compared to the Orthodox, but it's self-identified. And therefore the report in general is flawed in that regard. I don't know how many of the Jews who are identifying themselves as having been brought up Orthodox were actually Shomer mitzvahs when they say that they were brought up Orthodox. I mean, our Orthodox day schools, and they used to be even more, and our Orthodox synagogues, and they used to be even more, were comprised of many, many people who were not observant, but identified as Orthodox. In some ways, it's a tremendous tragedy to our community that our synagogues have become much more exclusively comprised of observant Jews. It's beautiful in many ways, but in many ways, it's very sad. But we don't know, when we talk about the transition from childhood to adulthood, from Orthodox to non-Orthodox, where they were never observant to begin with.
And so in your studies, when the OU does studies of the Orthodox community, it's not a self-reporting, it is these behaviors which identify.
Exactly.
And what are those key behaviors? You remember offhand which those were?
Well, there are depending on the age of the constituency. We tend to be studying younger people much more than older people. That's not to say we won't be doing a community-wide study at some point, but we have so many things that are on our plate in advance of that. Frankly, primarily at this point, we're focusing on doing evaluations of our programming to make sure that we're being as efficient and effective in deploying our resources as we should be. And we view that as our fundamental fiduciary duty. But when we were dealing with younger students, we would be identifying basic observances. Do you keep kosher? Do you go to shul? Do you learn any Torah? Do you keep Shabbos? What does it mean to keep Shabbos? Are you keeping Shabbos but texting or not? These are different categories within the Orthodox community that really informs us as to what constituencies need what kind of attention and help.
It was, several years ago, there was this scandalous statement that the number of young people who keep the half Shabbos was as many as 50% of our community. Never had any research behind that. Someone thought they read something that said that and then started blogging and picked up by the newspapers, etc. There was a recent study that was done through yeshiva high schools that SAR took the lead on, but involved yeshiva high schools around the country. And we discovered that those numbers were much lower, that really the most frightening statistic we came from that was substance abuse, specifically about alcohol in our community. That our teenagers in our community are actually behaving more dangerously than their peers in the non-Jewish community. Are there any other things that have really come up in your research when you look at the Jewish community that gets you scared?
Well, I'll tell you the most profound point that we learned in the studies we did of younger people, and that is that their degree of commitment and observance was far more tied to their parents' commitment and observance than it was to any other factor by far, in enormous degrees. And the difference between behaviors depending on their school, their community, their part of the country was almost insignificant. But tying it to the way they're like, if their father went to shul on Shabbos, they almost inevitably went to shul on Shabbos. If their father put on tefillin every day, they put on tefillin every day. But if the father was telling the children to behave in a more observant way, but they themselves were not, it didn't stick. And that was, to us, probably the most important lesson we learned from our studies of younger people, that the main influence on a person's Judaism and meaningfulness in Judaism is going to come from the home. And when it's not there at home, all that we could do in NCSY or in the day school movement or in the shul is going to be very weak without the parent being a primary partner in that effort.
There was a study done of the Christian community of what was the strongest variable to assure adult attendance in churches. And what they discovered was if the adults, when they were children, were forced to go to church by their parents on a regular basis, they developed the ritual of going to church and they continued to go, which often drives me a little crazy when I hear from parents, oh, they were really tired, I let them sleep in today. Or, you know what, I don't want to force them. I want them to come to it on their own. And if it doesn't come from the parents, we're fighting a losing battle, unfortunately. But by the way, if that's the case, then take NCSY for a minute, one of the most successful youth movements that anyone can imagine. It focuses on the kids. How do you get the parents involved? If the parents are going to be such a critical variable, how do we get the parents involved? Or the day schools, how do we get them involved?
Well, we're having a harder time exploring that issue with regard to the day school population in NCSY. But what we have seen is a significant trend in that favor with regard to the public school constituency that is attending NCSY. Our experience was over earlier decades that there was almost a tension between public school students who wanted to get more involved in their Judaism and their parents. And we're finding that to be quite to the contrary today. And parents are very encouraging of their children to come to NCSY, to JSU, which is our public school clubs. And we've started family Shabbatons for public school kids with their families, their siblings, and their parents with enormous attendance and participation. I think the types of Jews who are concerned about their heritage and concerned about their children having a flavor of Judaism as part of their DNA are much more receptive to looking to more traditional Judaism than they were in earlier times, because I think over time they've seen the alternative. And when you reference a Pew report that says that in the non-Orthodox community over the last 10 years, 70% of marriages were intermarriage, it's a wake-up call that there needs to be a greater degree of Jewish education, Jewish involvement, even if you don't want to be part of the Orthodox community. And this is one of the things that we're urging the other denominations of Judaism. Don't become Orthodox. It's your choice. But learn Torah, learn Judaism, learn history, and you'll have a different impact on your community.
And in terms of the success of working with other denominations, I know that there's a lot of interactions. I remember when I was president of the RCA, we were together with the presidents of the other denominations as well in different conversations. Does the OU get together with the United Synagogue or with the Reform movement in conversations about how to move our communities forward?
Well, we have a lot of interaction because we sit on committees together. For example, the Conference of Presidents, the World Zionist Organization, and there are many opportunities to develop serious relationships. I know that on our professional staff, Rabbi Hauer is developing a number of those relationships on a very serious basis, and there are conversations and discussions. There obviously is a tension, and there's constant tensions. I think the tensions are becoming exacerbated by the frustration of the other movements to be able to generate enthusiasm among their next generation, and that's a shame. We'd be much more eager to help them be successful than to try to let them think that we're in competition and that we're trying to get their congregants to go to Orthodox synagogues. We're much more interested in their congregants remaining Jewish and marrying Jewish and feeling a connection to Judaism.
If I can switch for a moment from the OU to you for a minute.
The OU is much more interesting.
I know, but you went to NYU, you went to Ner Yisrael, you are a senior partner in a major law firm. How did you get involved in the OU?
Well, I got involved in the OU because I discovered something when I was young. When I went to law school, my aspiration was to be a Jewish community activist. And because I wasn't achieving the degree of Talmudic scholarship that would make me eligible to be a significant rabbi and rabbinic leader, I decided to turn towards lay leadership as a more natural place for myself. And I thought that the law practice would give me an appropriate platform. And when I started off, I realized that there were a couple of fundamental decisions that you needed to make when you wanted to be a Jewish activist. The first question you had was whether you wanted to be an establishment person or an anti-establishment person. And I've discovered that over the years that either approach could be effective, and it depends on the personality and the background of the person to choose which direction to go. I'm a company guy. I was part of the system. I grew up in the yeshiva system, in the modern Orthodox system. I was a Bane Kiva kid growing up. I went to Gush before I went to Ner Yisrael, and I was connected very much to Rav Lichtenstein Zatzal as much as to my more longer Rebbe, Rav Yaakov Weinberg Zatzal. So I was part of the Orthodox establishment. So it was clear I was going to go in that direction. But there's a second threshold question, and that is whether, similar to the corporate world, whether you want to be an entrepreneur or you want to be a company man. And my inclination initially was to be an entrepreneur. And I started different projects on my own with my friends outside of the establishment of the larger organizations, thinking that there was more flexibility and you were able to pivot quicker and get things done without bureaucracies. And I did that for a number of years after graduating from law school. But then I discovered that it's similar to business in another regard. And that is when you create a program, a product for the Jewish community, it's like a business. You create a product to go to market, there are two things that are going to determine your success. Number one is the quality of the product, but number two is the distribution system that you have. You can have the greatest product in the world, but if no one's going to know about it, no one's going to buy your product. And Jewish community activism is the same. You can come up with a great program, but if no one's going to know about it, you're not going to have much of an influence. And I was spending much too much time on distribution, and I wanted to spend my time on product development. That was more exciting to me. So I looked around the community and I realized that the Orthodox Union was probably the most broad platform for distribution of Jewish Orthodox activities in North America by far. So when I was invited to join the board back, I was a young kid of 30, I eagerly accepted the invitation to be able to take advantage of that platform for distributing ideas and programs.
And your focus was more on NCSY in the begining, or it was on the general?
No, it was on the general. I had not actually had very much to do with NCSY at all at the outset. I joined the OU in 1990. In 1992, I became chairman of synagogue services. And then I went on to be chairman of a whole bunch of different divisions over the years, including NCSY for 4 years, which admittedly was the most enjoyable of the tenures that I had, and most purposeful in many regards. I spent 6 years as the chairman of the political division of the OU, and a lot was accomplished, but I didn't enjoy it at all. I mean,
there's no ebbing of Shabbos in the political division, I assume.
It wasn't the same.
But over the course of your tenure now at the OU, there has been restructuring of the OU. You brought in two new directors, both Rabbi Hauer and Rabbi Joseph, who are managing the professional side. The OU did lead in terms of COVID. One of the things that we say now is that we know there is only one community in the Orthodox United States that has Das Torah, and that's the centrist modern Orthodox community, because we listened very carefully to poskim that the OU helped coordinate all of those efforts. In addition to all of that, you've also, together with Alan Fagan, the former executive of the OU, professional executive of the OU, you created the research department. There have been so many things that you have accomplished in these 4.5 years. That actually seems a little bit longer than 4.5 years. What's on the agenda for the next couple of years?
Well, I think the most important undertaking that we're about to embark on is a review of, as I mentioned before, all of our programs. The Orthodox Union has expanded dramatically over the last 5 years. We've almost doubled our size in terms of programmatic impact and employee impact, et cetera. And it primarily has come as a result of community support. The community has been incredibly generous to our programs, has allowed us to grow significantly. And we think that we have evidenced the capability of doing significant things and intend to continue to grow. But that growth comes with it increased fiduciary duties to ensure that the monies that the community is generously giving us to implement programs are being deployed efficiently and effectively. So I think the next step that we're focusing on very heavily is that internal analysis and using that community research department to enhance our self-analysis to make sure that we continue to provide the best product to the community. In addition, over the last 4 years, you mentioned the Center for Research, Communal Research, but we've also started a number of other programs that are still in their infancy, including the Women's Initiatives Division, which has had an incredible a following of women, both in terms of Torah learning, which is critical for our community to embrace, that women need to become involved in Torah learning and not just scholars within the women's part of our community, but regular women who are now leaving school and going into the workplace or going into their homes as homemakers. They have to be involved in Torah study. And otherwise their religion is going to dissipate in terms of its meaningfulness. And simultaneously, we created, and now growing significantly, our Torah division, which was only created 4 years ago. And we've put out the Daf Yomi app, which has literally thousands of people using every day. We just came out a couple of weeks ago with our second app, the Al Parsha app, which we hope to have the same degree of success. It's an incredible app. Everybody who hasn't looked at that should download it. It's a free download and a free use. It has incredible shiurim, both in terms of starting the practice of Shnai Mikra V'Echad Targum, which is a halachic imperative that many of us follow and more of us should, as well as all kinds of enormous, interesting shiurim. We also have the Smichat Chaver program in the Torah division that has taken off. We also have another division that we just started under Rabbi Hauer's leadership called the Community Partnership Division, in which what we're trying to use, as I described earlier, the platform of the Orthodox Union to scale local programs that have success. And most of the creativity does not come from national organizations. Most of the creativity comes from local people, local institutions that are doing things on their localized basis. And we haven't learned how to exploit that and use that creativity to scale it on a broader base. And we've started a group that's going to be focusing on trying to effectuate that. And similarly, we have another division that we just started, was called the Impact Accelerator, also looking to start up community organizations and helping them grow. So there's a lot of growth that we anticipate, but we want to make sure we do that responsibly.
I think I need to thank you as well, because our shul won one of the Back to Shul grants, which we appreciate greatly, and is challenging us to actually do everything we said we wanted to do. If we're not for the OU, we wouldn't have been dreaming about things, and then we wouldn't have necessarily made it all happen. Sometimes you need that extra push, and I think that's one of the things that the OU has done so brilliantly. And it's also reorganizing even the representatives in the field. I know that one of our local young men, who's not so young anymore, Rabbi Phil Karish, has moved into a brand new role as well, which is very exciting.
Yeah.
And it continues to provide. So the OU is a presence. And the OU, the fascinating thing, which I think people need to understand, is the OU's presence is not as one type of orthodoxy or another type of orthodoxy. It somehow manages to bridge, very much like your own life, Gush and Ner Yisrael, and NYU in the midst of it as well. All of those different pieces coming together within the Orthodox community is sometimes fortunate enough to be able to avoid a label, which is very, very difficult in our community today. One last question, because our time is really ending, and it's a big question, so you don't have to answer it all. But in terms of the state of Israel and the changes in Israel today, is the OU have a voice in Israel about American Jewry?
We have a very large center in Israel, the Israel Center, which is not only a building that has programs within it, but operates a very significant number of social services and kiruv organizations within the Israeli community. What you're referencing is a component in which it's an American presence having in Israel vis-a-vis American issues. Most of the policies that arise in the Israeli scene are beyond the scope of the Orthodox Union. The policy that we've adopted many years ago is that when it comes to issues of security and other types of political issues, it's up to the Israeli electorate to determine their leadership, and we are supporting that leadership regardless of the direction that they take. There are, however, as you're inferring, issues that come up in Israel that affect us in America. For example, issues of conversion, and whether the standards that are going to be created in Israel are going to affect those of us in America. The same thing was true with Gittin. Certainly, we're concerned about kashrus of coming out of Israel, and fortunately, at this point, the vast majority of products coming from Israel to America include the OU Hechsher, so it doesn't create a problem. But if that would deviate, we'd be concerned about the reliability of products that we would not be familiar with the supervision. But once again, Israel needs to be governed by the Israelis, and it's presumptuous for us, just as much as sometimes irritates me when leaders in Israel tell Americans how to run American Jewry. And I think it's not only an entitlement issue, but it's also a familiarity issue. And just as I mentioned earlier, there are different types of rabbinic leaders for different types of communities. They're entitled to advise and direct their communities because they have the familiarity and the intimacy. We're not in Israel. We have our role in Israel. We have an Israel Center and our variety of programs, but we're not really in a position to dictate to Israel how Israel should be. That's the Israelis to determine. And if we want to change that, we should move to Israel, which we all think we should anyway.
And on that note, I just want to thank you again for your time. It has been a lot of fun. It's good to see you, and I'm looking forward to one of these days seeing you in person again, now that the airports are open and the world has begun to, thank God, heal itself finally.
Look forward as well.
Thank you very much, Yasher Koach, for all you have done and continue to lead our community with such grace and dignity. I appreciate it so very much.
Thank you. A pleasure.
Have a wonderful day.